Good morning. Chapter 3, Lecture A. This first part, this will probably be about 3-video lecture. I'll get through a bulk today, a bulk tomorrow, and then we'll look to finish up probably Monday with a lecture, and then we'll have the quizzes for this due pushed back a couple days, probably till Wednesday for Chapter 3. So yeah, that being said, this Chapter 3 lecture is going to deal with creating Anglo-America. Normal stuff there. Big questions for this. How did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century? How did slavery start and expand in the colonies? What major social and political crisis rocked the colonies in the late 17th century? And how patterns of class and gender roles changed in the 18th century America? Introduction. A series of crises rocked the colonies in the late 17th century. 1867, Indian alliances attacks. About 4,000 total perished and pushed settlers back eastward towards the shore. Metacom, known as the King Philip, was their main leader. He led ferocious attacks to push him back. But then, like I said, a ferocious counterattack by the English against the Indians is going to break the Indians' power. So the Indians kind of put a big surge here to stop the colonists, but it ultimately fails. Eventually, the Iroquois will just help the colonists. Atrocities were committed by both sides. Mostly the English, though. Metacom was executed. Bloodthirsty savage was entrenched in the minds of the colonists. Basically, this whole savage mind of like scalping and being bloody, sneaking up on people, killing them, murder, all that's going to be and backwards people is going to be ingrained in their minds. King Philip's War brought in the freedom of white New Englanders by expanding the land access at the cost of the Indians. So this not super long war, but King Philip's War is going to be important for the breaking of the Indians. Now, we're not going to get too crazy deep in it, but this is going to set a precedent for the late 1700s where there's a lot of changes going on in the colonies. The Indians are going to have a lot of problems, obviously, being pushed back, pushed further west. Then the British are going to go through a series of their own incidents that's going to affect their country. We're not going to watch this video, but on your own account, if you would like to watch it in the PowerPoint, it's great. By Crash Course helps explain some of this stuff going on, which deals with this term called mercantilism. So economically, looking at this first slide here, the main system they practiced was mercantilism. Government should regulate economy to promote national power. Think of the world as a giant pie with fixed amounts of slices. You would want the biggest slice of pie. So I know back there in the corner there, Gabe, you probably like pie. If I was to have a piece of pie, you would want whatever pie your choice is, the most of it, you would want the most of it, right, or all of it. Yeah. So mercantilism says the world is a fixed amount of wealth. At the end of the day, there's only so much money. We'll say there's $100 in the world. Obviously, there's a lot more, but just for argument's sake, you want as much of that $100 you can get. If you can get up to 60, 70%, you can probably control the world. So that's the way they viewed the world, that their wealth was fixed and you wanted them to control it as much as possible. Speaking more of like gold, silver, copper, etc., all the things you would think of. Above all, trade should be controlled so that more gold and silver flowed in the countries than it left them. So obviously they're going to plunder the colonies in the Americas to bring back to Europe and enrich them. This is what the Spanish were doing. The English now wanted to be part of that. In this view, the role of the colonies were they served the interests of the mother country, meaning, yeah, the colonies should exist and prosper, but at the end of the day, the most money should come back to the mother country, not the colonies. Commerce, not territory, or plunder was the foundation for empire. Thus, this is where the British are going to really invest in their merchant fleet. Navigation Act of 1651 aimed to wrest control of world trade from the Dutch, who were the FedEx of the day. That's what my best example is. The Dutch were like the movers and shakers of moving the products. They didn't necessarily make the products, they just moved it. The most valuable colonial products had to be transported in English ships and sold initially in English ports, then exported to the foreign markets. What this was, the British were controlling all of the elements of the trade so they could tax it. Foreign exports had to first go through England, then to the colonies. This helped increase profits in England through customs duties and also the colonies. New English shipbuilding industry grew because there's more ships needed. Also, what this is going to give birth to is my analogy of Chewie and Han Solo from Star Wars, who were smugglers. You're going to have smugglers. Now, at the end of the day, smugglers were allowed to exist for the most part because as long as they weren't interfering in the British profit, they really didn't care. New England, because the other thing about New England was it wasn't necessarily a place to grow crops, but they had plenty of trees. So a lot of the big ships of the line, big ships from the big timbers of the New England era were used to build British ships. Now, conquest of New Netherland. Charles II restoration in 1660 after the short civil war and the reign of Oliver Cromwell. He'll be brought back to be king again. The British killed the king. Now they want a son to come back. A Royal African Company will give a monopoly of the slave trade to bring slaves to the New World. The English won control of the Netherlands and several African ports in 1664 in a war with the Dutch. Charles II awarded the colony of New Netherland to his brother James, the Duke of York, and thus this colony will be renamed New York. And this will be the foundation what will become New York City. British transformed it into an important imperial outpost. English expanded the freedom of some, but reduced others. Women lost the ability to control their own business and their name, expelled free blacks from skilled jobs and restricted them, and land was given to few select families. Thus, in the New Netherlands area, people will lose land that will be given to the few elites and upper society. New York and Indians, covenant chain, alliance of the Iroquois Confederation, led by Sir Edmund Andros, governor of New York, helped clear lots of land, and they're going to make a deal with the Iroquois Confederacy up there dealing with land and other things. Now, Iroquois will be pushed by Great Lake tribes and the French. So the Iroquois, though they are more favorable to the British, they will be pushed by other Indian tribes because they allied themselves with the British, and then the French will obviously attack them because they're allied with the British. The Charter of Liberties, going to global competition expansion of England's Empire 3. Charter of Liberties. Many New Yorkers began to complain that they were being denied the liberties of Englishmen, the right to consent to taxation. This sounds familiar. Fast forward 100 years later, we have a new country called America, but still 100 years before this, people were complaining about taxation and representation and fairness. In 1683, the Duke of York agreed to have an assembly, drafted the Charter of Liberties and Privileges, trial by jury, security of property, and religious toleration of all Protestants. This actually sounds somewhat familiar. So this becomes a basis for some of the New York things. Some of the stuff will get carried through, some of it will not. But the whole point here is self-government is now taking on more and more role. The British didn't get heavily involved in this area for one major reason. In the 1680s, there's turmoil back in England again over James, I believe it's James II's reign and his return of England trying to return England to Catholicism. And in 1688, the British are going to go through what's called the Glorious Revolution, in which the British completely transformed the monarchy. And we'll get to that in a later lecture and section. But basically, the British are more concerned about what's going on at home than the colonies. The founding of Carolina, global competition expansion of England Empire 4. It's not until 1670 that the first settlers arrived to found Carolina, originally an offshoot of Barbados, armed friendly Indians and enslaved others. Between 1670 and 1720, more Indian slaves were exported from Charleston than a number of African slaves imported. So initially, Indians are more used than Africans. This will change later, but you start to see this knowledge and premise of expanding slavery in the Carolinas. The Yamasee Uprising was crushed and most Indians were driven out. You're also going to see more move towards African. The Yamasee Uprising was dealing with, I think, African or Indian slaves and Indians. So you're going to see now instead of, and the other thing is, if you enslave an Indian here, if they escape, they know the area, right? They know the language. They know everything. An African slave, you bring them in, they don't know the area. They don't know the language. Whole alien world to them. It's a lot different to move through an alien world versus a world you know. The fundamental constitutions of Carolina in 1669 proposed to establish a feudal society for hereditary nobility, serfs, and slaves. Now, this is what the Carolinas, they basically promoted a feudal society. The irony here is, though this will not take shape in the traditional feudal manner, guess what happens? With this whole idea of slavery expanding in the Carolinas, Africans become the slaves, obviously, or the serfs working the land. Then you have a middle class and then an upper class. Not everyone, and so that lower class is the poor farmers who barely strike. So have to depend on the rich elites for help at times, right? So you actually create almost a feudal society. That's when you get to this 1850s and 60s United States and South Carolina to the south, it almost looks feudal because, well, it really is based on what they wanted, which was a feudal system. Now, in order to attract settlers, it provided an elected assembly and religious toleration and a head right system of 150 acres, which is still pretty good for the time. Rigorous legal code that promised slave owners absolute power and authority. Those who brought slaves Initially, slaves instantly acquire large new land holdings. Introduction of rice made it an epicenter of mainland slavery. And also, if you had slaves, it was status. It showed you had money and you could be very influential. The Holy Experiment, the last English colony to be established in the 17th century, was Pennsylvania. It was founded in 1681 by proprietor um, William Penn. Envisioned a place of religious harmony and Indians and whites could coexist. Penn was a Quaker, but he was a pacifist, thus he believed in nonviolence approach to everything. Quakers were more tolerant and open to things. Penn considered his colony a holy experiment like the Puritans, but unlike the Puritans, he was much more open and tolerant to others. He hoped everything would be governed according to Quaker principles. All persons were equal. Liberty was an universal entitlement, not the possession of any single people. Pacifist, we talked about that. Christian liberty to all, affirmed the belief in God, did not use their freedom to promote licentiousness or basically living loosely, living crazily or anything like that. You're living basically out as an extension of God, for God, and you have a purpose. Jews were barred from office, though, ironically enough. The one group of people that will not be tolerated is Jews. Strict code of personal morality. So this whole experiment in Pennsylvania is actually pretty moderately successful. Though far from perfect, it does have a uniqueness as compared to like the Puritans up in Massachusetts, which was much more radical, right? They were kicking people out. You were either damned. The Quakers didn't necessarily go to those roads. Land in Pennsylvania, Penn established an appointment council to originate legislation in assembly. Indentured servants who owned land of 50 acres were allowed as well. So you could be an indentured servant, own land, and have opportunity. This is new. Indentured servants wanted to come to Pennsylvania because of that draw. The colony unsurprisingly prospered because there's a lot of ways people can make money and be successful. Ironically, his success helped lead to the deterioration of freedom of others. As it goes on, initially it's very, very free, and but as naturally goes, more people move in, and it's going to change the philosophy, and freedoms will be reduced. We'll do a couple more slides here. Origins of American Slavery 1. Insist demand for workers. Fired Chesapeake planters to turn to slave or forced them to turn to slave labor. As they need more demand for their now rice fields, indigo fields, tobacco fields that are prosperous, they need more workers. Slaves offer many advantages over indentured servants. They're cheaper, longer lasting. Englishmen and Africans. English had long viewed all alien peoples of disdain, including the Indians. Indian Africans are no different. Africans were seen as alien, so they were enslavable. They were not of God's stock. As bad as it is me to say that, that was the viewpoint. Slavery in history. Slavery had always existed for almost the entirety of human history, so they had that to go by. Slavery in the Americas was based on the plantation system, which was basically a feudal system. The agricultural enterprise that brought together a large number of workers under the control of a single owner. These plantations will be basis what we will get later into American history if we think of the Deep South. Slavery would become to be associated with race, a concept that drew a permanent line between whites and blacks. So no matter what a black person did, if they were free or not, they were always associated as a slave. There's no difference between a slave. All blacks are slaves in the view of whites for the most part. Now, slavery in the West Indies, which is Origins of American Slavery 2. Slavery in the West Indies or the Caribbean, where Dorian just did its wrath here not too long ago, was slow to take off, viewed as too costly. Sugar, though, is going to drive people to bring slaves to the West Indies. Sugar was the first crop to be mass marketed to consumers in Europe, and that ties back to the sweet tooth with tea. The British loved tea, thus tea needed sugar for sweetening. Plantations of the West Indies took off, and thousands of Africans were now imported. There was a seasoning period as well as the Indians to make our slaves because they could adapt to the new climate. Usually about 10% of the slaves would die in the seasoning period because of exposure to diseases or whatever. So for every 100 or so, you'd probably have 10 or 20 that would die, give or take, just based off diseases. And basically, they just want to make sure they live. Slavery in the law. Spanish had given slaves some rights under law, and there was ability to escape slavery in the Spanish system. English were more repressive, especially to obtain freedom. There is evidence of some free blacks in early Virginia, but also against them and enslaving them more. Okay, next slide. Origins of American Slavery 3. Got 2 slides and we'll be done for the day. The rise of Chesapeake slavery. No law to refer explicitly to slavery to the 1660s about what couldn't be done. In an attempt to improve the status of white servants, attract new settlers, establish a child born to slave parents remained a slave, and Christians could not own other Christians as slavery. Ironic as much. So basically what they're going to look at is whites could not own other whites, but blacks could be owned by whites, though even if they claimed to be Christian, they weren't viewed as Christian. And then if a slave had a child, that child was instantly still a slave. So they're starting to make a rigid society in which there was no social mobility. You were forced to stay in that area. Now, Bacon's Rebellion, Land and Labor in Virginia. In 1676, Governor William Berkeley had run a corrupt regime for 30 years. Local elites enjoyed the benefits of the tobacco farms and the profits from it. It was a very good scheme. Now, the poor were starting to look like those in England, lots of them. They outnumbered the elites. Freed servants and lower-class farmers despised this and losing precious land also. Many hated the tolerance of Indians and not fighting them that Governor Berkeley had arranged. It was a corrupt regime, by all accounts. Paid the Indians off, or basically didn't go after them, treated the poor, the bulk of the society very badly. Only people could take that for so long. Nathaniel Bacon, an ambitious planter, waged a rebellion against the Indians and Bacon, or against Berkeley. Though Bacon died and the rebellion was put down, it shifted the concept of labor towards using African slaves and giving lower whites more freedom. Thus, we're going to give more whites freedom so they don't get cantankerous and rebel, and we're going to use more slaves and have a more progressive policy toward Indians. A slave society. Now, Bacon's rebellion is a factor. Death rate began to fall and become more economical to buy a slave. So after Bacon's rebellion, there's going to be a shift towards more slaves. Royal African Company's monopoly on slave trade will, though, end, and it will open up for more people to make money. Once again, one thing you haven't figured out, money drives a lot of this stuff. Economic concepts, money, a movement in society are going to drive a lot of these things. House of Burgesses we found in 1705 enacted a new slave code, or House of Burgesses it was not founded in, but my bad, it will enact a new slave code. Slaves were property, not people. Whites and blacks henceforth were tried in different courts, and runaway slaves also started to happen in the colonies. Okay, that's going to conclude this lesson for today. The next lesson we will get into the Glorious Revolution, the changes in the 1680s that are going to trickle down to the colonies.